Today, our feature program is a debate between our honorary member, Bill Gates Sr., and McIlwain over the controversial 1098 ballot initiative, which would require wealthy citizens of our state to pay an income tax. Moderating the exchange will be Q13 Fox News anchor and fellow Seattle 4 member, Mark Wright. Mark?
Good afternoon. President Sten, thank you very much. Fellow Rotarians, distinguished guests. Initiative 1098 takes on one of the most contentious issues you can talk about in the state of Washington. I recently was talking with someone, and they said discussing the income tax in the state of Washington is like arguing with that gas attendant in Oregon when he won't let you pump your gas. And I've done that. And it's a no-win situation. But what I love about today is it's not a traditional debate. We've asked two very distinguished gentlemen to take 15 minutes and lay out, in their opinion, their best case as to why 1098 should either pass or be rejected by Washington voters. I like the fact that it's not going to be a back and forth that gets into the rhetoric, but they're just going to lay out their cases as best they can. So our speakers don't really need much of an introduction. I think all of you are very familiar with them. William Gates Sr. is a well-known philanthropist, a lawyer, co-chair of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Matt McIlwain has a tech background. He has served on a number of tech boards in Washington. He's considered a leader in the tech industry. He is currently managing director of Madrona Venture Group. So the way it will work today is each will lay out their 15-minute case, and then we'll have some Q&A to wrap things up. Starting things out, William Gates Sr. Mr. Gates, please come up.
Thank you, Mark, for that kind introduction. It's really a pleasure for me to be here today to address this group of engaged Washingtonians with what is my last presentation, I believe, on Initiative 1098 before the election. And now that the lights have gone out, I'm going to struggle a bit to read my remarks. I'll do my best. Let me mention to you that you have on your table one copy of all of the slides that will be on the screen, which may help you to read some of the fine print. This presentation is closely related to one I gave in 2003 when I was honored by this club with an honorary membership. At that time, I asked you to consider one question: what is it worth to be an American? Today I ask, what is it worth to be a Washingtonian? After 7 years without reform, with growing inequality and with dramatic deterioration in our ability to fund education and basic health care, you have an opportunity to respond to that question. Over the next 2 weeks, you and other voters of Washington State here have an historic opportunity for positive change. You have a chance to pass I-1098. And before I go any further, let me just ask one question. How many of you have already voted? It's quite a few. Okay. Well, sleep easy. I-1098 was put together by a coalition of respected business, labor, and community leaders who support a careful, balanced reform of our state's tax system. It is designed to benefit the majority of its citizens, strengthen small business, and generate more than $2 billion in a year for investment in basic health plan and much-needed restoration and reform of our education system. Over 200 organizations have already endorsed the initiative to date, and this slide shows a sample of these endorsements. So, we all love Washington State and care deeply for the future of its citizens. But our coalition is concerned about the direction our state is heading. The first and major impetus for this initiative is to respond to the needs of education. Our state constitution describes education as the paramount duty of the state. According to court rulings, the legislature is required to make ample provision to educate all children residing within the state. As you all well know, a King County judge recently ruled that Washington is violating this objective of the state constitution. That decision is on its way to a higher court. The problem underlying this ruling is just hanging over our head, and it isn't going to go away. We are compelled to do something. Meanwhile, the needs are only growing. To improve the dismal performance of our education system, the legislature actually passed significant education reform in 2009. It enhanced the legislative definition of basic education to insert a variety of national best practices, including a requirement for longer school days, a requirement for 24 credits as against a current requirement for 20 credits, and an endorsement of bold reforms. Meanwhile, the economic crisis has meant decreased revenues for education over the last 2 years, rather than the increase needed for these reforms. Instead of adding the teachers we need, we are laying them off. Instead of reducing class sizes, we are increasing them. Instead of making college more affordable, we are letting tuitions at our colleges and universities skyrocket. In 2010, we know the governor and legislature had a difficult time balancing the budget, needed a month-long special session to create a budget composed of cuts and new revenue, primarily from the so-called 7-Eleven taxes. Although many people don't like these taxes, the legislature used them to help avoid a whole range of difficult cuts. These aren't cuts to so-called inefficiencies, but cuts to effective programs like full-day kindergarten for children in poor communities. Make no mistake, all of these will be back on the chopping block to balance the governor's next budget, given the state's dismal revenue forecast. And what makes all of this worse is that we've been moving in the wrong direction for more than the last 2 decades. Our opponents claim we're spending enough on education given increases in recent years. But they repeatedly failed to adjust the numbers for our state's dramatic economic growth and population growth. As these charts show, we began disinvesting in education well before the recession. The first chart shows a drop in investment in K-12 education from 24th in spending for the size of our state economy to 46 out of 50. Our funding per pupil has also fallen behind 20 states from 17th to 37th in just 15 years, even without the paramount duty language in our Constitution. I have the temerity to suggest that these graphs establish undeniably that we are not performing to our own expectations. The second major impetus is that there has also been a diminishing of health care coverage in our state. Thousands of seniors and disabled lost adult day health care and services for those at risk of being placed in a nursing home. State funding for child vaccinations has been cut back. In 2009, 40,000 state residents lost coverage under the voter-approved basic health plan. In 2010, there was talk of cutting another 70,000 residents and eliminating the plan altogether. This graph shows the decrease of those on the health care plan over the last 18 months versus the dramatic increase of more than 100,000 residents on the waiting list. Finally, the third major impetus has to deal with our tax code. If you think we were looking bad in our educational rankings of 46th, how do you feel about a ranking of 50 out of 50 in terms of the basic fairness of our tax code? Washington's tax code ranks dead last. The chart here shows the percentage of income that various portions of our population pay to support state and local services. It is broken into quintiles. That's 5. And then the wealthiest quintile that is the 3 bars to the right, is broken down into the next 15%, the next 4%, and finally the top 1%. Within these groups, all of these groups, the red bar represents the sales taxes, the green bar represents property taxes, and the light blue bar is the total. What this shows is that we have a situation where those who make the least income in the state pay somewhere over 17% of their incomes in taxes each year, while the wealthiest people pay 2.6%. This means the state's poorest citizens pay relatively 6 times as much of their family income to support the state as do its wealthiest citizens. The middle class pays 4 times as much, 11% versus 2.6%. To further put that in context, this may be the worst picture of our state. It shows how we look relative to our closest neighbors. All 4 of these charts follow the same system as the last. The one new element is that Oregon, Idaho, and California all include a blue bar that is a state income tax. The important thing to note here is that in each of our neighboring states, those light blue bars for each group form a relatively straight line across the top. It's not perfect, but it means all parts of society are contributing relatively proportional shares of their income to support the vital functions of the state. And then there's Washington, with stark regressivity and a vertical axis for our lowest income people, that is 17%, which is double the 8.5% found in Oregon and Idaho, and almost double the 10% in California. Now, what possible defense is there to a tax structure like that? But this not ultimately a presentation about tax reform today. It's a presentation about the pressing need to fix some important problems like public education, health care, and the B&O tax. It's a presentation about where we might go to most fairly fund solutions to these problems. And the answer is a limited income tax on those of us who have basically had a free ride here for decades. When faced with such critical needs and egregious unfairness, it comes down very easily to asking our most well-to-do citizens to invest a bit more in our state's well-being. Not because I'm a do-gooder or because they should give a handout, but because the wealthy benefit asymmetrically from a healthy society, and it is in their own self-interest to invest in it. Let me repeat, we are talking about investment here. Investment in our health care and in our students, an investment with a spectacular return. And with I-1098, we do this by increasing the tax burden of our wealthiest citizens up to just 5.3% of that part of graph 1, which I showed you on the right-hand end, from 2.6 to 5.3. That's why I felt it necessary to help move forward on I-1098. To be clear, it is not just an income tax. It will actually cut taxes for the vast majority of Washington state citizens. Key elements include a 20% cut in the state portion of the property tax and the elimination of the B&O tax on 118,000 small businesses. It will then create a modest income tax on the wealthiest 1.2% of households in our state who can afford to pay. Individuals making more than $200,000 per year or couples over $400,000. This reform will allow us to cut property taxes on working and middle-class families, yet still raise some $2 billion a year dedicated to funding education and health care. The revenue raised will go to the Education Legacy Trust account, which funds priorities like K-12 class size reductions, extended learning opportunities, pre-kindergarten, and expanding access to higher education. And a portion will be dedicated to funding the voter-approved basic health plan, public health services, and long-term care for vulnerable seniors. And that's the core of the initiative. It's common sense tax reform that would benefit the vast majority of individuals and businesses in the state. It will not solve all our problems, but it will be a step in the direction of tax reform and go a long way towards meeting our funding gap. A long ways toward meeting our needs for funding for our principal obligations to our society and our children. In response, some opponents of the measure have loudly raised concerns that the legislature might not use the money for its stated purposes, or, going the other way, might expand the income tax to everyone with above a typical exemption level like $15,000. Let me assure you that we shared those concerns when drafting the initiative. That's why we have built in accountability and transparency provisions, like regular audits and reports, as well as an explicit provision that income tax rates and brackets cannot be changed without a vote of the people. But more importantly, I deny the possibility of shifting money away from education, given the constitutional obligation for its ample funding. Yes, the legislature has shifted dedicated funds in the past, but 9 times out of 10, this is to pay for education and health care. Is this a reason for inaction? And as to the legislature adopting a general income tax without a public vote, forget it. When a commission created by the legislature recommended such a fundamental change to eliminate our regressivity, they paid no attention. In fact, as the Seattle Times pointed out in a front-page story last Monday, the legislature has shown little will to raise broad-based taxes of any kind. The last time they raised the state sales tax was in 1983. And if the legislature chose to commit political suicide by altering the limited income tax we have proposed, is there any doubt that there would be a referendum or an initiative for its repeal? The primary claim beyond those fears is that this is a threat to our business community. It will ruin our competitive advantage and chase businesses away. Although compelling to those who don't want to pay more taxes, the argument here is based on a debunked theory that personal income tax somehow slow economic growth. I'm going to pass on the slide from Forbes magazine, and let me just say that I invite you. I thank you for the invitation to be present. I hope you will consider this initiative with an open mind and share what you've learned with others. We simply can't continue to fund a 21st century education and public services with a pre-World War II tax structure from 1935. This is a good thing. It's good for Washington. Thank you.
All right, Mr. Gates, thank you very much. I can't wait to tell my kids I kicked Bill Gates' dad off the stage today. That's going to be fun at the dinner table tonight. Mr. Gates, in all seriousness, thank you so much for that. Mr. McIlwain, you will have up to 15 minutes. Let's make it 16 minutes for your presentation, and Heather will have your time cues here.
You're going to hear a very different perspective on 1098 from me, and ultimately it'll be up to you to decide what you think is the right thing to do in terms of voting on 1098. Let's start with the facts. 1098 creates a state income tax with the 4th highest tax rate in the country. So we lose a competitive advantage that we have as a state to attract and retain the best and brightest people to drive economic growth for our state in the future. It is the largest tax increase in the history of Washington State. And it is a tax that taxes your salary, your capital gains, your S corporation and LLC income that flows through to the owners of those businesses. It allows for no Schedule A deductions. That includes charitable contributions, that includes home mortgages, and it is not indexed for inflation. And regardless of how any initiative is written, the reality is that our state legislature, under our Constitution, can and has shown over and over and over again that they will change initiatives, and in particular, change and move the money around in dedicated fund initiatives. In fact, over the past 20 years, 100% of dedicated fund initiatives have been modified by the state legislature. And in the last 10 years, 74 so-called dedicated funds have been rated, many of them multiple times, by our state legislature. We can debate whether that's fair or not, but it is what it is. To the question of real tax reform, there was a commission in 2002 that Bill Gates Sr. headed, and it talked about real tax reform that would be an across-the-board income tax done in a revenue-neutral way by reducing the sales tax so we could address the regressivity issue that Bill raises, but 1098 does nothing about. And as you can see from this chart, our sales taxes have only gone up and to the right over time and are at 9.5%, which is the third highest in the country, which contributes to why Washington State citizens pay the 12th highest per capita taxes and revenues to the state of all the states in the country. We are 12th highest. And as you can see, without any tax reform as it relates to sales tax, the introduction of 1098 would create the fourth highest income tax rate in the country. We miss the opportunity, in my opinion, for real tax reform once we hand the power of an income tax to our state legislature. It's just too tempting for them over time not to use it if and when they get into a jam. Now, you can debate about what might happen, but let's look at the last state that created an income tax. I was at the Kennedy School of Government 20 years ago in Massachusetts when our neighboring state to the south was debating this policy under a new governor who had pledged not to introduce an income tax, Lowell Weicker, but in fact did introduce one in 1991. It was meant to be temporary on high earners and at around a 4% rate. Today, Connecticut has a permanent tax with a top rate of 6.5%, and it starts at $13,000 of income. And they're not alone. We can look at the history of all taxes in our state. We can look at the history of all income taxes in other states to recognize this pattern. But the real killer for Connecticut is what has happened to job growth. Since 1992, the year after it passed, till today, 0% job growth in Connecticut. Is that what we want for Washington State? Is that in the best interest of all citizens of Washington State? I don't think so, and I hope you'll agree with me. But let's bring it a little bit closer to home. There was a tax policy fork in the road some 80 years ago between our neighboring state to the south, Oregon, and Washington. And while there are many factors that affect per capita income and employment, here are the current facts. Washington State citizens enjoy a $6,000 on average advantage in personal income, and at the moment we enjoy a 1.7% advantage. We are below the national average in unemployment. Oregon is well above. That represents 60,000 jobs. 60,000 less jobs we would have if we were under policies similar to the policies in Oregon. And I can refer you to Art Laffer's piece in the Wall Street Journal a couple weeks ago that talked about all 11 of the last states over the last 50 years that introduced a state income tax and the relatively poor performance they've had in per capita job growth, economic growth, and perhaps paradoxically, tax revenue growth. Because it's the very fact that Washington has been an innovative, fast-growing state that we've actually generated more total tax revenues from our sales taxes, our increases in property values, and yes, that B&O tax, which is a complicated animal. It brings in $3 billion a year. It's not reflected at all in the charts you saw Bill present today. It's excluded from those charts. Let's talk for a minute about education reform. Everybody in the nonpartisan Defeat 1098 coalition cares about great education, educational opportunities for everyone, and real education reform. But here are the facts. perhaps presented in a different way than you just saw them. Our state K-12 education budget has increased 65%, from $10 billion to $17 billion over the past 12 years. The same kind of increase from $6 billion to $10 billion has occurred in higher education. We are spending a lot of money, and it's a lot of money that needs to be spent, don't get me wrong. But we should be asking the question, why is it that in the city of Seattle we spend $12,746 per pupil per year to deliver K-12 education? Is it really a function of putting more money into that system to get better results? Or is it a function of real reform? And we'll come back to that in a second. And the legislature has this track record on dedicated funds. And so any fund, including a fund dedicated to education, can be moved around one way or another. The other irony, and I mentioned it before, about 1098, which goes to why it's the wrong tax at the wrong time for our state, is that 88% of education and healthcare charitable giving comes from those households that have $200,000 in income or more. Now, that's a national number. It reflects on Washington, which is a very generous state. And we're not even providing an incentive like the vast majority of states that do have income taxes provide in terms of tax relief when people choose to make charitable donations. Now, I know all of you give because you believe in causes, but this is an economic reality that first, with taking the money out of the hands of private citizens and giving it to the government, would reduce charitable contributions, and then having no charitable deduction, we believe, would significantly reduce nonprofit contributions in Washington state. And finally, if you haven't seen it yet, and this goes back to the real education reform issue, I would encourage you to go see the movie Waiting for Superman. And I don't cry a lot at movies, but you will probably cry like I did when you see and hear about Anthony's story. And then you will probably gasp when you hear and learn about what the rubber room is in the state of New York. Finally, you will wonder why, in the innovative state that we have, we do not allow charter schools to exist in Washington state as an experiment. And you'll be intrigued to know who are some of the most vocal spokespeople for it in the movie. But go see it. So there is this core question of fairness. And what about fairness? Do you think it's fair that there's no real tax reform in 1098, that there's no sales tax reduction for the folks that are at the low income end of our society? And do you think it's fair to create a state income tax and expect less than 2% of the citizens to pay for the benefit of 98% of the citizens? And do you think it's fair the way our legislature works? I may not think it's fair. There's nothing that's being done about it with 1098. It is what it is. They can and will change initiatives and move dedicated funds around. And then we've already talked about the charitable deduction issue. And do you think that's fair? And so these are the things that we in the Defeat 1098 Coalition believe. But at the end of the day, I would ask you, what do you believe? Do you believe that 1098 creates an income tax? It's not often talked about in the ads of the other side. Is it an income tax that you believe, at the end of the day, will be extended to everyone, like every other state and at the federal level? The history is clear. Is 1098 real tax reform? Is it the kind of tax reform that the fellow I got to sit next to his dad at lunch today, former Governor Dan Evans, multiple times tried to get adopted in the state of Washington with real constitutional protections that initiatives don't have? And what about our future? Do we want to end up like Connecticut? Do we want to go down the path of our sister state to the south? The vast majority of people in our grassroots, nonpartisan coalition and beyond are saying that they agree with us that you should vote no on 1098. Every major newspaper in the state of Washington everyone has said no on 1098. Small and medium-sized businesses and chambers of commerce and organizations are constantly coming out and saying, this is a bad idea. Think about what its impact on S-Corps and LLCs is. Think about job creation and economic opportunity. And even the large businesses and the very rapidly growing businesses, most of whom would most suffer because of their ability to attract and retain the best and brightest to build their companies and the next generation of companies, are saying no. But they're also saying no, and I've had specific conversations with people at Microsoft, Amazon, and Boeing about this. They're saying no because they know that their business depends on an ecosystem of Tier 2 and Tier 3 Boeing suppliers, many of whom are S corporations, an ecosystem of small to medium-sized businesses that sell in the Amazon marketplace, and an ecosystem of software companies that build on Microsoft's operating system. All of them have come out and said we're against 1098. And again, it doesn't matter as much what they think. I want you to know that. It matters what you believe. A few other facts here. Most people do believe, 89% in the King 5 poll, that 1098 will extend to everyone. Over time, that income tax will spread to everyone. And here's a specific quote from former Governor Dan Evans' piece in the Seattle Times almost a month ago. The one other thing I do want to alert you to, because it's important to follow the money, is where the money has come from for the pro and the con side of 1098. Our side comes from thousands and thousands of citizens, Washingtonians, who believe that 1098 is the wrong tax at the wrong time. In sharp contrast, over two-thirds of the over $6 million raised by the yes side comes from labor unions. I don't begrudge those labor unions making those donations, but I think, as has been articulated more clearly in the Seattle Times and other places recently, they have a clear agenda of not only what they hope to see happen with the revenues from 1098, but the leverage they would have on the state legislature for getting it passed. And much of that money comes from outside of the state. This is what's at risk. Our future. An ecosystem that has great anchor tenant resources like Microsoft and Boeing and Amazon. And yes, the University of Washington, which is a critical asset for all of us and must thrive. And as you see that ecosystem now, and you think about what we can do as Washingtonians together, I would encourage you to vote no on 1098, to join our coalition at defeat1098.com and share these facts with your friends so that we can have real innovation, real reform, and a better future for all of us here in the state of Washington. Thank you very much.
All right, Mr. McIlwain, thank you very much. We have just a few minutes. We have just a few minutes. I wanted to just clarify a couple points before. I know, Matt, you have to get to a very important phone call coming up in about 3 minutes here. First, Mr. Gates, when you were helping create 1098, was there a discussion of adjusting sales taxes for low-income residents to make the entire tax system more fair?
Yes, there was. There was a discussion of an enormous number of other possibilities. That was one of them.
Mm-hmm. So how come it didn't make it onto the ballot?
We think it would have been terribly unpopular and had no chance of passing.
Okay. Matt, I wanted to ask you a question about would you support an income tax in the state of Washington under other circumstances?
You know, I may support an income tax under other circumstances, and a broad number of people in our nonpartisan coalition would be for tax reform such as that was proposed in 2002. But that is not the vote that we have as citizens of Washington State over the next 2 weeks. We have to decide whether 1098 is the right tax at the right time and whether it is in the best interest of the citizens, and in my opinion, forgoes the opportunity for real tax reform by taking power out of the citizens and giving it to our state legislature.
If 1098 passes or fails, what's your message to the legislature? Mr. Gates, you first. If 1098 passes, what's your message to the legislature? Or if it fails, what's your message? They clearly haven't dealt with this issue.
I have no idea what my message to the legislature might be. I would think I might not be particularly effective witness anyway at that point. So, if it passes, then it will put our legislature in the position of dealing really carefully and thoughtfully with the basic education issues and how to use a significant amount of money to refurbish and revive our public education system. That's exciting.
Okay, Mr. McIlwain.
Well, especially if 1098 fails, then I think we need to go to our legislature and say, where are you on the priorities for our state? Why do you keep moving money around to different places? And have you actually looked at the opportunities for real reform in education? Things like charter schools, things like allowing Teach for America teachers to teach in our state. And there's a very long list. And if you talk to state legislators, as I have, they know that list's out there. Just like they know that we should create a subsidies commission and look at all the subsidies in our state. And we could go on. Time doesn't allow. There's a lot of things our state legislature can do to spend money more cost effectively and be able to operate within the resources that they have.
All right, unfortunately we are out of time. Mr. McIlwain, Mr. Gates, thank you so much. Let's give them a warm welcome, a warm round of applause for your presentations today. Thank you. And President, stand back to you.
Thank you very much. We are adjourned.
Seattle Rotary Online is made possible in part by a grant from First Choice Health, working with the Washington Health Information Collaborative to use technology to bring better health care to patients throughout the Pacific Northwest. First Choice Health,